So now we're going to start with that same service we were working on before. Remember that when we called it from within the same process, all we did was basically create an intent to actually specify the class that we wanted to use it with. In order to make this visible to others, in order to make this visible to components and other processes, we don't have to change the actual application or any of the source code itself. The only thing we have to do is go out into the manifest and change that. All right, so I'm going to go out here to my manifest, and all I have to do here is now inside of my service, I'm going to add an intent filter. And an intent filter simply identifies that this component knows how to handle certain types of intents. In other words, it basically supports a form of late binding. And so I've got my intent filter. And intent filters support lots of different kinds of tests, but the easiest one is to support an action test. And if you think about an action test, what that really is simply kind of like a string name for almost like a function call or something, right? It just identifies an action or an activity. I shouldn't say activity since it's an Android word. An action or some operation that you want to support, or you want to expose, I should say. So what we do is we just go ahead and add an action tag. And the action has a name. And this name is just a string. And by convention, you actually qualify the string using, in effect, a namespace, or like a package name, right? So since our package for this is com.pluralsight, we'll say com.pluralsight. And since it's an action, we actually put it in the action name. And then this can be any naming we want, any string that's kind of meaningful within our system. So I'm just going to call this do work. And that actually sets up my action. So what that says now is that this service will respond to an intent that actually sends that action. Right? And that's all we have to do in order to make this service now visible to other components. And keep in mind, the fact that we're doing this does not mean that we can no longer use the class specification from inside this process. What it means, though, is that components outside this process can now access this service by passing an intent with the appropriate action. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I've created a separate application. Okay, this application is a very simple activity, right? And all it has, again, is an activity with it. Its name shows that it's a remote activity. If we were to look at the actual string values for it, we'll see when we start it up, it says it's my remote client. And I've got this handler in here, call service, that goes with the menu option. And what I want to do is that inside this call service, I want to access that service. Now, notice that one thing I've done is that I have that little helper class in here, log helper, so I can see the process ID and thread that it's in. But one thing, notice that nothing inside of this application actually has any knowledge of that service component that's inside of my other application. Right? There's no kind of library bound in here or anything. Right? This is just a standalone application. And this shows how intents are useful for calling services because it allows us to do it through a late binding mechanism using just the intent. This application doesn't have to have any knowledge at all about the way that service is implemented. So what I'm going to do is that just like whenever I call a service, I define an intent. So we'll start by doing that. I'm going to call this my service intent. The difference is, though, when I create this intent, I'm not going to use that class name like I did before. Instead, what I'm going to do this time is use the intent that accepts a string as the name of the action that I want to use. Right? And so that string is going to be the same string I used when I defined a filter. So this will be com.pluralsight.action.doWork. That defines the intent. So I've defined basically a late binding mechanism. And remember that when I defined my service, I actually allow it to accept a parameter, or I should say an extra, called file name. So I can attach that to this as well. My service intent. I'm going to put extra, call it file name. And the value I'm going to give to it, we'll call this a remote client file.out. Right, so that sets it up. So I've created that intent. So now that I have an intent that defines the service, or I should restate that. And now that I have an intent that identifies the service, basically it's the service that supports that action string, and I pass the parameter, I start the service just like I did before. I call start service, and I pass my intent. And it's really that simple. Now, just like last time, I want to give the user some kind of feedback this is going on. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a toast and show that again. So I define the toast, and then I'll just show it. All right, and that sets it all up for us. Okay, so I'll do a quick build here, make sure I didn't make any mistakes. All right, so let's go ahead and start up now by running our service again and calling it from its own process, right? So here I'm back in the inside of the activity that's inside the same process as the service itself. So let's go ahead and launch that in the debugger. All right, so I'm here inside the emulator. So I'm going to go ahead and click it and say do work. And we'll notice here that when we hit our breakpoint, right, we're inside of the activity that's in the same process, right, because it's using the intent that identifies the class. Right, so we'll go ahead and let that guy run. And of course, we see that it hits the breakpoint calling into the service. So all that stuff still works, right? So we'll let that finish. Okay, but now what I want to do is I'm going to switch back over to my other application that tries to access the service using the action-based intent. All right, so I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I go ahead and run this guy. If you see here, this is my Pluralsight remote client, right? This is the other application. When I say menu, I say call service. Of course, I hit my own breakpoint right inside of there where I'm actually going to call out to it. The key thing now is that when I release this, I'm actually going to hit the breakpoint in the other application. We'll see that now. I'm here in my on-handle intent, right? And if I step through this, you see the file name I got is remote client file.out, right? So you see that that application had no knowledge of the service other than what intent to use to call it, right? So let's just go ahead and let this finish. And see we were able to access the service just fine. But let's take a look at what's going on in the Android.logcat. So if we take a look here, when we accessed it initially, right, we accessed that service from the activity in the same process, right? We saw those my activity do work. The process ID was 1398 on the main thread. And of course, the services process ID was 1398, but was on a different thread. Right? But now let's look at Logcat near the bottom where I accessed it from the other application. So you notice here when a remote client do work, right, that was running in process ID 1444, right, on its main thread. But notice that the on-handle intent was still running in that process 1398. Right? It actually made a cross-process call. Right? So it was able to actually access that service and pass the information through the extras. Again, with that application having no knowledge of the service except for the intent to use to access it. Right? And that's really where the power of services starts to come together, is this ability to do the late binding and hand off operations to other processes. Right? And the other thing that's interesting too is that in this particular case, I had already started that process that housed the service. Had that process not already been running, when the client application tried to access it, the framework, or I should say the operating system, would have automatically started up the process containing the service and then handed the work off to it.